For the first time in 2 years, this video is in a mega metropolis, believe it or not. This YouTube presentation. You can see the concrete jungle behind me. I'm not happy to be here, but I need to be here today. Who knows why, but no trees, no birds, no wind, just the concrete jungle, you and me. And I got thinking that around 70% of the population for the next few years, that's the world population, will be living in cities, huge cities across the world, ranging in size from 30 million to 1 million. That's 30% of the population. That's almost 5.5 billion people crammed into these spaces, living on top of each other. I mean, a lot of these places, and I'm videoing from Melbourne currently, make ants' nests seem roomy. So what allows these huge conglomerations to exist? It's very simple. Energy. Now, energy, not only do you have no electricity, but you have no internet. If you have no electricity, you have no internet. You have no banking, because all banking is now interlinked. You have no petrol pumps working. You have no credit cards working. You have most of the hospitals shut down because they rely on a significant supply of energy to function. So the 21st century world is very different to when human beings congregated around fires for their energy needs. And most of their energy needs came from their muscles, their ability to do things independently of an external energy force. So civilization, if you call living in a concrete jungle civilization, is totally dependent on energy security. And as we transition slowly, very slowly in this country, from fossil fuels to other forms of energy like hydroelectricity, solar energy, wind energy, we are in a position where we don't need to repeat the mistakes of the past. And as far as the mistakes of the past are concerned, in capitalist societies, those involved in private investment for private profit, we have made more than most over the last 40 years through a privatisation agenda, which has privatised every aspect of energy production. Energy energy distribution, energy sales, and the list goes on and on, has all been put in the hands of the private sector. And we find it extremely difficult transitioning from a fossil-based economy to a renewable energy economy. And the question of energy security becomes fundamental in any discussion in a 21st century society which is totally dependent on energy. Even the most much vaunted electric cars rely on energy, electricity. Everything seems to rely on electricity. So what are we doing as we move from fossil fuel dependent economy to a renewable energy dependent economy and lifestyle? It's not just an economy. It's about the interaction between human beings on this planet. How we interact, what we do, is all dependent on the type of energy we have and that energy security. Unfortunately, although we're transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we have not learnt one lesson from the mistakes of the past as far as privatisation is concerned and as far as the manufacturing of centralised energy sources is concerned. The two most important things in Western societies regarding energy production has been the formation of massive fossil fuel energy production resources which provide energy for millions, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world. And we seem to be moving in the same direction as far as renewable energy is concerned. Because the privatisation agenda which dominates renewable energies today is dependent on private corporations having a monopoly on the production of energy in centralised mega farms, mega wind farms, mega solar farms, which are outside this concrete jungle which I'm speaking from, where energy comes into the concrete jungles. Now, we were able to see, to a significant degree, that decentralised energy is feasible. And all the solar panels which are appearing on roofs across this country with and without government support highlight the fact that you don't need some huge centralised energy source to provide energy for the majority of the population. Obviously you may need some large centralised energy sources to provide energy to certain manufacturing parts of the economy, but as far as the general economy is concerned, the population is concerned, you don't need it. By relying on a centralised energy source, what we do is we set ourselves up to fail. If there is an economic catastrophe, or a military catastrophe, or a natural catastrophe, it's very easy for these centralised energy sources to be taken offline and for hundreds of millions of people to find themselves without energy. So why are we moving in this direction of creating these large centralised energy sources? So we're moving in that direction because that is the best way in a privatised energy system that you can actually control the amount of profits you are able to generate from the monopoly you are able to exercise on the production of energy. And the few energy crises we've had over the last few months highlight how important it is to take energy out of the hands of these large centralised bureaucracies and place it back into the community's hands. Now these are very simple words. What does that mean in reality? It's all very well for me to carry on here about, centralised energy sources, decentralised energy sources, local communities, privatisation, publicly owned. So what is the reality? The reality is that in a city of 5.5 million people, as we have here today, we just don't need solar energy panels on private homes and some private buildings. We don't need some massive external generation capacity. We may need it in terms of an emergency backup, but as far as local energy production is concerned, what we need is publicly owned local solar farms. You can place these farms on top of buildings. All buildings have a roof, or most have. You can place them on the side of buildings. You can put them on stilts and put them in public parks. You can put them on footpaths. You can raise them above traffic heights and put them on footpaths. And you can create energy sources which can be fed into a grid for the city, which provides energy. And situations of a lack of energy, you could have a backup solar farm to make up that difference. Simple. But we're not talking about this today. And we are currently seeing legislation placed through the Victorian Parliament which will make it more and more difficult for local communities to set up their own decentralised, publicly owned energy sources. Because what the energy companies are demanding is a monopoly on the production and distribution of energy. Because they realise that if significant communities set up their own energy sources, which are either community owned cooperatively, owned collectively, or publicly owned by the state, then their monopoly is threatened, and in time they will see the profits they are able to generate from maximising return from these monopolies disappear. So we are at a critical juncture in society, especially as we transition from a fossil fuel based economy to one based on renewable energy. Because the infrastructure we set up now is the infrastructure which will be there for the next 50 to 60 to 70 years. As we saw with fossil fuel production, the infrastructure which was set up 30 years ago is what determined the fossil fuel renewable energy debate over the last decade or so. So it's important that we put pressure on state and federal governments to fund locally owned energy, decentralised energy sources, or publicly funded or publicly owned decentralised energy sources throughout a city the size of Melbourne, with a emergency backup generation facility and batteries outside that network. So in these uncertain times where war is always on the horizon, especially considering the United States policies as far as world domination of resources and the economy is concerned, and the fact that we are hanging on to the coattails of Uncle Sam, the spectre of war is something that will be with us for decades if we continue to follow these policies. And when you're faced with war and centralised energy sources, it's very easy to cripple a 21st century society by knocking out those energy sources. It's extremely easy to do so. So in terms of defence, having publicly owned local renewable energy sources is critical. In terms of the economy, it's critical because there is nothing worse than a stop-start economy which revolves around limited supplies of energy to ensure all facets of that 21st century society can continue to function. So we are at a critical juncture which governments at the state and federal level are doing their very best to ensure remain in the hands of privately owned monopolies and duopolies. And it's time that pressure was placed on state and federal governments to ensure that resources are not only channeled into the pockets of the fossil fuel industry as it transitions to a renewable fuel industry, but that resources are available to local communities who wish to set up decentralised energy sources for a specific group of people or a specific community or a specific geographical area. Because if you want real competition in any walk of life, you need competition between the privately owned monopolies and the state sector and the collective and community owned sector. Now in Australia, the collective community owned sector is insignificant, if non-existent. The publicly owned sector has been shrinking rapidly during the privatisation era over the last 40 years, and the private sector has grown topsy. It's grown to such an extent that it dominates every aspect of our existence, even water and critical energy sources. So instead of governments funneling money into private residences to set up solar panels, it could funnel that same amount of money into the hands of local communities to set up grids to service a specific number of homes and businesses. And having that decentralised energy source is fundamental to the existence of any community which is totally dependent on energy. For us to continue to allow monopolies, duopolies and private interests to dominate energy production, distribution and sales means that whether we have fossil fuel with increasing CO2 emissions or renewable energy with decreased CO2 emissions, the fact is that ultimately we will still find ourselves in an insecure position as far as energy security is concerned. So think about it. And if I decide to run this campaign in the state election, in the seat of Mulgrave, the seat of the Premier, Mr. Daniel Andrews, one of the policies I will be talking about is publicly owned local energy production in order to ensure energy security for everyone in a large city the size of Melbourne with a population of 5 million people. Think about it. Do you want to be part of some huge, centralised, globalised monopoly which can be shut down at any time? Or do you want to have energy security and have multiple thousands of small publicly owned energy hubs which produce energy for a fixed number of people, and at the same time having outside the major metropolises, the major cities, large solar and wind farms to act as backup in times when local energy needs a backup from a centralised source?